demarcation line, thus tacitly acknowledging the legitimacy of the Saigon regime. Equally vital to the Nixon administration was specific mention of the sovereignty of the Saigon government, and on this point too, the U.S. had its way. Hanoi finally conceded that, in Kissinger's words, there is an entity called South Vietnam. In one important sense, the dispute over that question was what the war in Vietnam was all about. Again, utterly and transparently false in every respect, as a comparison with the text just quoted immediately demonstrates, although in accord with Kissinger's deceptive version of the agreements taken as sacrosanct by the loyal media. An honest and independent press would have announced the January agreements with headlines reading, U.S. announces intention to violate the agreements signed in Paris. An informed press would have observed further that the Paris agreements incorporate the principles rejected by the United States at Geneva 20 years earlier, as well as the essential principles of the NLF program of the early 1960s, which were similar to those advocated by Vietnamese quite generally and constituted the crucial fact that impelled the United States to escalate the war so as to block a political settlement among Vietnamese. The actual press simply adopted Washington's version of the agreements, never mentioning that this version contradicted them in every essential respect, and thus guaranteed that the war would go on, as it did. Once again, the contribution of the media was to help implement further violence and suffering by adopting Washington's version of events, in this case, in the face of the fact that this version was, transparently, in flat contradiction to the documents readily at hand. One would have to search assiduously to discover a more blatant example of media subservience to state power. The aftermath was predicted in the alternative press, and similar to earlier occasions when the same factors were operative. As after Geneva 1954, the Communists, who had won a political victory on paper, attempted to pursue political struggle while the United States and its GVN client at once turned to military force to overturn the terms of the Paris agreements. These facts were reported by the more serious journalists on the scene in Vietnam, notably Daniel Sutherland, who observed from his extensive investigations that the Saigon government has been guilty in by far the greatest number of cases of launching offensive operations into territory held by the other side, assuming that it has the right, despite the ceasefire, to take back territory which it lost in 1972, and giving many examples, as did others. The U.S. government informed Congress cheerily that the GVN has fared well during the post-ceasefire maneuvering, adding 770 hamlets to the list of those over which it has dominant control after the agreements, and in violation of them, a fact that passed without notice. The GVN thus added 1 million people to the area of its control, while expending 16 times as much ammunition as the enemy, and using the newly provided U.S. equipment as intended for massive military operations, including extensive bombardment of PRG areas to prevent refugees from returning to them as provided by the agreements. The media either blamed the Communists or sometimes the GVN as well, but not the United States, which had announced at once its intention to disrupt the agreements and now publicly expressed its displeasure in the military actions that successfully achieved this objective. When the North Vietnamese finally responded to U.S. GVN violence, the GVN quickly collapsed, leading to outrage in the U.S. government and media, which still persists, over this dramatic demonstration of communist iniquity, which proves that their intentions all along were to destroy the free and independent government of South Vietnam and to reduce its people to communist tyranny, thus further entrenching the principle that communists cannot be trusted. This useful lesson, firmly established by media complicity in transparent government deceit, has, not surprisingly, been applied in subsequent efforts by the U.S. government to gain its end by violence. One dramatic example was featured in the media in August 1987, when the Central American presidents confounded Washington's strategy by adopting a political settlement that undermined the familiar U.S. reliance on force to compensate for its political weakness. As part of its immediate efforts to sabotage this agreement, the State Department called the Latin American ambassadors to Washington, where they were presented with a copy of the 1973 Paris Peace Agreement that was negotiated to end the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War, the Wall Street Journal reported, adding that the agreement was subsequently ignored by North Vietnam. The journal explained that this unfortunate Vietnam experience, which proved that agreements with communists are not worth the paper they are printed on, is one factor in administration skepticism about the Central American Agreement. Copies of the 1973 Paris Agreements were distributed to the envoys as a case study of how an agreement with ambiguous provisions could be exploited and even ignored by a communist government, Neil Lewis reported in the lead story in the New York Times, adding, "In violation of the 1973 Accord, North Vietnam overran South Vietnam and united the two parts of Vietnam under its banner in 1975. The utility of a carefully crafted historical record, designed by the loyal media to serve the needs of state power, is revealed here with much clarity. Surveying these events, we reach essentially the same conclusions as before, although once again the performance of the media, at the peak period of their alleged independence and adversarial stance, goes well beyond the predictions of the propaganda model, exceeding the expected norm of obedience to the state authorities and reaching the level that one finds in totalitarian states. As before, the servility of the media made a significant contribution to ensuring that the slaughter in Indochina would continue and that the U.S. government would be able to exploit its Vietnam experience as filtered through the media for later exercises in international terrorism. The remarkable performance of the media also laid the basis for the post-war interpretation of what the war was all about and why the United States failed to attain its ends, a matter to which we turn in the next section. 5.6. The Vietnam War in Retrospect. In April 1975, the war came to an end, and the 30-year conflict entered a new phase. Indochina faced the near-insoluble problems of reconstruction in a land that had been reduced to ruin by foreign armies after a century of colonial oppression. In the United States, too, elite groups faced a problem of reconstruction, but of a different kind. The problem in the United States was the reconstruction of ideology, the taming of the domestic population that had lost its faith in the nobility of intent and the inspiring benevolence of the elites who determine U.S. policy. It was necessary to overcome what Norman Podhoretz, echoing Goebbels, calls the sickly inhibitions against the use of military force, the dread Vietnam syndrome, finally cured by the stirring triumph of U.S. arms in Grenada, so Podhoretz hoped. This was part of a larger problem, the crisis of democracy perceived by Western elites as the normally passive general population threatened to participate in the political system, challenging established privilege and power. A further task was to prevent recovery in the societies ravaged by the American assault, so that the partial victory already achieved by their destruction could be sustained. As we have heard, through the mid-60s, the media loyally fulfilled their function of service to state violence, and there was no significant popular opposition to the U.S. attack on Indochina. True, in 1964, the population voted 2-1 in favor of the peace candidate, who was assuring them that we want no wider war, while laying the groundwork for the rapid escalation planned for the post-election period, a noteworthy illustration of the character of electoral politics in a society lacking genuine opposition parties and a critical and independent press. Nevertheless, the enthusiasm of the ideological institutions for the rapid escalation of U.S. efforts to defend South Vietnam from internal aggression helped keep the public in line as the U.S. invading army rose to over 500,000 men on the ground and appeared to be attaining some success in grinding the enemy down by sheer weight and mass, although at horrendous cost, in the words of the pacification chief Robert Blowtorch Comer, later to become a high-ranking official of the Human Rights Administration. By 1967, the popular mood was shifting, and the public was beginning to defy the hawk-dove consensus of elites, for whom the issues were limited to tactics and expedience, a matter of much government concern. Defense Secretary McNamara warned the President in secret in May 1967 that expansion of the American war might polarize opinion to the extent that doves in the U.S. will get out of hand, massive refusals to serve or to fight or to cooperate, or worse. At the time of the Tet Offensive, the Joint Chiefs of Staff were concerned with our capacity to meet the possibility of widespread civil disorder in the months ahead. In considering further troop deployments, they took care to ensure that sufficient forces are still available for civil disorder control, including National Guard forces deployed under state or federal control, and U.S. Army troops. The Pentagon warned further that a request for more troops might lead to increased defiance of the draft and growing unrest in the cities, running the risk of provoking a domestic crisis of unprecedented proportions. Earlier, the Pentagon feared that escalation of the land war between South Vietnam might lead to massive civil disobedience, particularly in view of opposition to the war among young people, the underprivileged, women, and segments of the intelligentsia. The sight of thousands of peaceful demonstrators being confronted by troops in battle gear during the massive anti-war demonstration and massive march on the Pentagon in October 1967 was particularly disturbing, the Pentagon Papers analyst observed. The gradual withdrawal of the increasingly demoralized U.S. military forces led to a diminution of visible protest by the early 1970s, but the Vietnam syndrome was never cured. As late as 1982, 72% of the public, but far fewer opinion makers and, to judge by other evidence cited earlier, virtually none of the American intellectual elite, regarded the Vietnam War as more than a mistake. It was fundamentally wrong and immoral, a disparity between the public and its leaders that persists as of 1986. The primary task facing the ideological institutions in the post-war period was to convince the errant public that the war was less a moral crime than the thunderously stupid military blunder of throwing 500,000 ground troops into an unwinnable war, as the respected New York Times war correspondent Homer Bigart explained, while chastising Gloria Emerson for her unwillingness to adopt this properly moderate view. The purpose of the war must be perceived as preventing North Vietnam from subjugating South Vietnam, John Midgley, the real enemy, of course, being North Vietnam, supplied and sustained by the Soviet Union and China, Drew Middleton, all in defiance of the plain facts. The primary issue was the cost to the United States in its noble endeavor. Thus, Robert Nisbet describes the intellectual pleasure he derived from a truly distinguished work of history with the chapter covering the 1960s, with emphasis on the Vietnam War and its devastating impact upon Americans, obviously the only victims worthy of concern. To persuade elite opinion was never much of a problem, since these were the reigning conceptions throughout, and clearly privilege, along with media access, accrues to those who follow this path. But the public has nevertheless remained corrupted. An ancillary task has been to keep the devastation that the United States left as its legacy in Indochina hidden from public view. Indeed, one finds only scattered reference to this not entirely trivial matter in the U.S. media, a remarkable achievement given the agency of destruction and its scale. Keeping just to Vietnam, the death toll may have passed 3 million. In an article entitled "Studies Show Vietnam Raids Failed," Charles Moore observes that the CIA estimated deaths from bombing of the North at well over 30,000 a year by 1967, heavily weighted with civilians. Crop destruction programs from 1961 had a devastating impact, including aerial destruction by chemicals, ground operations to destroy orchards and dikes, and land clearing by giant tractors, Rome plows, that obliterated agricultural lands, often including extensive systems of paddy dikes and entire rural residential areas and farming hamlets, leaving the soil bare, gray, and lifeless, in the words of an official report cited by Arthur Westing, who compares the operations to the less efficient destruction of Carthage